The first warning of the human attack came when an asteroid slammed into the Sakari homeworld, shattering cities and shaking General Linux to his core as warning klaxons blared across the bridge of his command ship. Linux's clawed hands gripped the arms of his chair. He leaned forward, mandibles clicking rapidly as the main view screen displayed a massive rock, easily several kilometers wide, plummeting toward the planet. It moved blindingly fast, far beyond any natural asteroid. "Ready planetary defenses. Scramble intercept ships now," Linux barked at his crew. They scurried to obey, inputting commands into holographic displays. Particle beam cannons on the surface swiveled skyward and opened fire, lancing out with searing light. Destroyers and frigates peeled away from orbital guard stations, racing to meet the incoming projectile. Their weapons hammered it, blasting off chunks. Linux watched in numb horror as casualty reports flooded in, the numbers climbing rapidly into the millions. A chime sounded, indicating an incoming transmission. The view screen flickered, and a human face appeared, a male with grey hair and a uniform bristling with medals. "This is Admiral Mark Bennett of the Terran Expeditionary Force," the human said coldly. "Your attack on our colony was a fatal mistake. The asteroid strike was merely a demonstration, a warning shot. For decades, you Sakari have expanded unchecked, conquering and subjugating other species. But that ends now." Linux's throat felt dry. This couldn't be happening. The humans were a minor power, lacking the advanced warships or planet-cracking weaponry of the major players, yet they had just unleashed devastation on a scale he could barely comprehend. Bennett continued, his voice hard. "You have one rotation to surrender unconditionally, and withdraw all forces from occupied systems. Fail to comply, and we will hit you again and again until nothing remains of your wretched civilization. You drastically underestimated our capabilities. Do not make that mistake a second time." The transmission cut out abruptly. Linux slumped back in his chair, the magnitude of the disaster sinking in. The Sakari had always viewed the humans as weak, as a species ripe for conquest. They attacked a human colony, expecting easy victory. They never could have imagined the humans were capable of assembling such a kinetic kill vehicle, of raining Armageddon on their homeworld. Linux stared at the devastated planet, at the cracks spidering across the continents where the massive projectiles struck. As secondary explosions and evidence of tectonic instabilities dotted the globe, the true ramifications settled in his gut like lead. The humans just knocked them down to a pre-spaceflight civilization. Further orbital strikes could blast them back to the Stone Age, or to extinction. The Sakari stood on the precipice between survival and total annihilation, and Linux now had to decide between capitulation or gambling, that the planetary defense grid and the Grand Fleet could hold off the wrath of an enemy they had so badly misjudged. The fate of his entire species hung in the balance. Linux's clawed fingers flew across the holographic interface, inputting the encryption key for the secret communication channel. He recorded a terse message outlining the devastation and the human demands. His words were clipped, mandibles tight with barely suppressed fury and desperation. "Send everything you have, every ship, every soldier. This is a fight for our very survival. We cannot let the humans dictate terms. Linux out." He ended the transmission and turned to face his battered bridge crew. They looked to him, eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Linux drew himself up to his full height. "We will not surrender," he said, voice booming across the command deck. "To yield is to abandon everything our ancestors fought for, to spit upon the glory of the Sakari dominion. Even now our brethren are marshalling the full might of our species. We will regroup, we will strike back, and we will teach these upstart humans the folly of challenging us." Linux slammed a fist on the arm of his chair. "To your stations. Ready every weapon, charge the shields, and prepare to move out. Today we fight not just for our territory, but for our very right to rule the stars." The crew leaped into action, a renewed sense of purpose driving them. If they were to die, they would die as warriors. "Imati Safa." A holographic strategic display hovered in the center of the briefing room, the main Sakari systems glowing an angry red. Admiral Bennett leaned forward, studying the real-time data feeds. "They're not backing down," he said grimly. "In fact, long-range scans show a mass mobilization of their forces, troop transports, capital ships, everything they have." His senior staff exchanged uneasy glances. General Tycho, a grizzled veteran, spoke up. "Then we hit them again, harder this time. Blitz their shipyards, ammunition depots, anything that lets them prolong this conflict." Bennett nodded. "Agreed. We have to keep them on the defensive, never give them a chance to catch their breath. If they manage to launch a counterattack—" He didn't need to finish that thought. They all knew the stakes. Xavier, the diplomat, cleared his throat. "Admiral, I must advise caution. We've already dealt them a grievous blow. If we push too hard, we risk shattering any hope of a peaceful resolution. There could be ripple effects across the entire galactic community." Bennett fixed him with a steely look. "They attacked us, Xavier. Slaughtered innocent civilians. This stopped being a diplomatic issue the moment that first drop pod hit dirt. The only way to ensure a lasting peace is to break their ability to wage war once and for all." He turned back to the display, watching the dance of ships and fleets, red and blue icons converging toward flashpoints, spread across a dozen systems. This was no longer a border skirmish or a punitive expedition. It was total war, and the fate of Earth, of the very future of humanity, would be decided in the cold depths of space and on the surfaces of alien worlds. Bennett's teeth clenched. The burden of command of the terrible choices to come settled upon his shoulders like a leaden shroud, but he would not falter, could not falter. For the sake of all he held dear, he would see this through to the bitter end at any expense. As Linux surveyed the regrouping Sakari fleet, a sudden chime from the communications array broke his concentration. The main view screen flickered to life, revealing Admiral Bennett's stern visage. This time, he wasn't alone. A human with softer features stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back. "General Linux," the new human spoke, his voice carrying a conciliatory tone. "I am Xavier, diplomatic liaison for the Terran Expeditionary Force. We wish to discuss terms that could end this conflict without further loss of life on either side." Linux's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation to his subordinates. His initial instinct was to spit defiance at these humans who had brought such devastation to his homeworld. But as he opened his mouth to refuse, the tactical displays caught his eye. The Sakari fleet, once the terror of the galaxy, now appeared as a ragtag collection of battered vessels. "What exactly are you proposing?" Linux asked, voice dripping with suspicion. Xavier leaned forward slightly. "A face-to-face meeting between yourself and Admiral Bennett, neutral ground to discuss potential compromises." Linux's claws dug into the armrests of his command chair. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was a trap, a ploy to lure him away from what remained of his forces. And yet, his tactical mind couldn't deny the precariousness of their position. If the humans struck again with the same ferocity as before, would anything remain of Sakari civilization? "Very well," Linux growled after a long pause. "But we meet on our terms, the Centauri Nexus Station. It's still under our control, and I won't be lured into some human ambush." Bennett nodded curtly. "Agreed. We'll transmit our arrival time shortly." The screen went dark, leaving Linux to ponder if he'd just made the greatest mistake of his life. Hours later, Linux stood rigidly in the Centauri Nexus's primary conference chamber. A contingent of his most trusted warriors flanked him, their weapons prominently displayed. The hiss of the airlock announced the human delegation's arrival. Bennett strode in first, followed closely by Xavier and a small group of aides. The two sides faced each other across a long obsidian table, the tension so thick it was almost visible. Bennett's eyes narrowed. "Subjugation was never our goal, General. Our aim is to halt your expansionist aggression and protect the species you've victimized in your endless conquests." The debate quickly grew heated, with both sides hurling accusations and justifications. Just as it seemed the meeting would devolve into a shouting match, Xavier stepped forward, hands raised placatingly. "Gentlemen, please," he interjected. "Perhaps there's a middle ground here. General Linux, what if the Sakari agreed to cease military expansion and withdraw from occupied worlds? In exchange, Earth would provide humanitarian aid and technological assistance to help rebuild your homeworld. Linux's mandibles twitched rapidly as he processed the offer. His warrior's pride rebelled at the thought of accepting help from those who had humbled them so thoroughly. And yet, images of the devastation wrought by the asteroid strike flashed through his mind. How many generations would it take for the Sakari to recover on their own? A heavy silence fell over the room. Linux's subordinates shifted uneasily, awaiting his response. Finally, the general spoke, his voice low and carefully measured. "Majesty will take your proposal under advisement," Linux said. "But make no mistake, convincing my people to accept such terms will not be easy. We have known only conquest for generations." Bennett nodded solemnly. "We understand. Take the time you need to consult with your leadership, but know this, our offer of aid is genuine. We believe a lasting peace is possible if both sides are willing to work for it." As the human delegation filed out, Linux's mind raced. He had bought time, but now faced the daunting task of selling this compromise to the Sakari High Command. The fate of his entire species hung in the balance. Linux's claws clicked nervously against the polished surface of the conference table as the debate raged on. The High Command Chamber, once a symbol of Sakari unity, now felt like a battleground. "We cannot bow to these humans," Admiral Zorgax thundered, smacking his palm down. "Our ancestors would spit on us for even considering such weakness." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hardliners' ranks. Linux's mandibles tightened, but he held his tongue. This was a delicate moment. Commander Vex, a decorated veteran, spoke up. "And what of our people, Zorgax? Our homeworld lies in ruins, millions dead. How many more must we sacrifice to your pride?" The chamber erupted into shouting. Linux raised his voice, cutting through the din. "Enough! We must approach this rationally. The humans have demonstrated power beyond our previous estimations. We cannot—" A sudden chime from Linux's personal communicator interrupted him. Excusing himself, he stepped into an antechamber, heart racing as he saw the message origin, Xavier. The human's words chilled him to the core. A coup. Zorgax planning to seize control and reignite the war. Linux's mind raced, weighing options and consequences. He gathered his most trusted officers in secret. "We must act swiftly," Linux said, outlining the situation. "If Zorgax succeeds, everything is lost." They moved under cover of night, a strike team infiltrating Zorgax's compound. Alarms blared as they breached the perimeter. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, scorching walls and dropping guards. Linux led the charge, his combat instincts honed by years of warfare. They fought their way through corridors, the sound of battle echoing off metal walls. In the compound's cavernous hangar, Linux cornered Zorgax. The Admiral snarled, drawing a ceremonial blade. "Traitor!" he spat. "You would destroy everything we are." Their duel was fierce, a blur of slashing claws and ringing steel. Linux's younger reflexes gave him an edge, but Zorgax fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. In the end, Linux stood victorious, Zorgax pinned beneath him. "It's over," Linux panted. "Your coup has failed." The High Command was stunned as Linux presented the evidence of Zorgax's treachery. Faced with irrefutable proof, they had no choice. Zorgax was stripped of rank and imprisoned, his supporters quickly falling in line. In the days that followed, Linux found himself elevated to Supreme Commander, his first priority reaching out to the humans. As he prepared for the monumental meeting with Bennett and Xavier, Linux watched the first human aid ships descending through Sakari skies. A new chapter was beginning, fraught with challenges, but also hope. "We have a long road ahead," Linux muttered to himself, straightening his formal attire. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the diplomatic dance to come. The future of two species now rested on his shoulders. "The first aid shipments have arrived," Bennett said, his voice gruff but steady. "Medical supplies, food, construction materials, but we both know that's only the beginning." Linux nodded, his mandibles twitching. Agreed. Rebuilding our cities is one thing, reshaping the very core of Sakari society, that's a challenge beyond measure. Xavier leaned forward, hands clasped. Which is why we propose embedding human advisors throughout your civilization. Schools, communities, even military installations. Linux's eyes narrowed. You want to place your people in positions of influence? Many will see this as an invasion by other means. It's a risk we have to take, Bennett countered. Your people need to be immersed in new ways of thinking. It's the only path forward. Linux paced, his mind racing. The humans were right, but the potential for backlash was enormous. Finally, he turned to face them. Very well, but tread carefully. The wounds of war are still fresh. Weeks later, Linux stood atop a landing platform, watching as a sleek human shuttle touched down. A group of advisors emerged, led by a woman with graying hair and sharp eyes. General Linux, she said, extending her hand. I'm Dr. Emily Carson. We're here to help. Linux clasped her hand, acutely aware of the curious and often hostile stares from the Sakari onlookers. Welcome to our world, Dr. Carson. I hope you're prepared for a challenge. Emily's smile was tinged with drive. We always are. The following month saw Emily and her team integrating themselves into Sakari society. In a vast agricultural dome, human agronomists demonstrated advanced irrigation techniques, coaxing life from the asteroid-ravaged soil. Sakari farmers watched with grudging interest as withered crops began to flourish. In a military academy, Emily stood before a class of young officer cadets, their scaled faces a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Let me tell you about the Battle of New Shanghai, she began, her voice carrying across the room. Human forces, outnumbered and outgunned, held the line against an invading army. Not for conquest, not for glory, but to protect innocent civilians evacuating the planet. A ripple passed through the room. One cadet raised a clawed hand. But without conquest, how do we prove our strength? Emily smiled. By having the strength to resist conquest, by standing up for those who cannot defend themselves. That takes far more courage than simply taking what you want by force. As she spoke, Linux observed from the back of the room. He saw doubt and curiosity warring on young faces, the first cracks in generations of ingrained beliefs. But not everyone was receptive to change. In the dark corners of the capital city, Commander Vazka hunched over a holographic display, surrounded by like-minded dissidents. Linux has sold us out, Vazka snarled. These humans seek to neuter us, to strip away everything that makes us Sakari. A chorus of angry agreement filled the room. Vazka's eyes gleamed with malice. We'll show them the true strength of our people, starting now. Across the city, explosions rocked human-occupied facilities. Alarms blared as fires raged and panicked civilians fled. Emily found herself pinned down in a research lab, plasma bolts sizzling overhead. Linux's response was swift and brutal. Security forces swarmed the streets, hunting down Vazka's followers. But as the dust settled, he knew more drastic action was needed. In the ancient arena of Karthul, thousands of Sakari gathered. At the center stood Linux and Vazka, circling each other with weapons drawn. The crowd roared, bloodlust and uncertainty mingling in the air. Linux's voice boomed across the arena. This ends today. We settle our people's future the old way, through honorable combat. Vazka lunged, his serrated blade flashing. Linux parried, countering with a swift strike that drew first blood. The duel raged on, a brutal dance of skill and savagery. From a private box, Bennett, Xavier, and Emily watched with nervous excitement. The fate of two civilizations hung in the balance. Vazka pressed his advantage, his attacks growing more frenzied. But Linux's newfound dedication gave him strength. With a lightning-fast move, he disarmed his opponent, sending Vazka crashing to the ground. The crowd fell silent as Linux stood over his defeated foe, blade poised for the killing blow. Instead he spoke, voice ringing out. I offer you a choice, Vazka. Cling to the old ways and die here, or embrace a new path and help forge a better future for our people? Vasca's eyes darted between Linux and the expectant crowd. His voice was barely a whisper. I yield, for the sake of our people. A deafening cheer erupted. As Linux helped Vasca to his feet, he caught Emily's eye in the stands. There was a long road ahead, but the first crucial step had been taken. Linux's claws clicked against the polished floor of the Dreadnought Subjugator's bridge as he paced, his eyes fixed on the console displaying the arid surface of Ricorius below. The massive warship hung in low orbit, a silent sentinel over the colony that had, mere hours ago, greeted them with volleys of plasma fire. "Still no word from the surface, Supreme Commander," the officer replied, mandibles twitching nervously. "Governor Zaris maintains radio silence." Admiral Bennett stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "We can't let this drag on, Linux. Every moment we wait gives Zaris time to dig in his heels." Linux nodded, his four eyes narrowing. "Agreed. Prepare a shuttle. We're going down there." The descent to Ricorius was tense, the shuttle buffeted by hot, dusty winds as it cut through the planet's thin atmosphere. Linux sat rigid, flanked by Bennett, Xavier, and Dr. Emily Carson. As they approached the sprawling military complex that served as the colony's seat of power, a swarm of Sakari fighters fell into escort formation around them. The shuttle touched down on a landing pad, surrounded by towering walls of reinforced alloy. As the hatch hissed open, they were greeted by a phalanx of Sakari troops, their plasma rifles trained squarely on the new arrivals. "Keep your hands visible," a gruff voice called out. "Any sudden moves will be met with lethal force." Linux stepped out first, his head held high. "I am Supreme Commander Linux of the Sakari High Command. We come in peace."
The security forces parted, revealing a stocky Sakari male with battle-scarred scales and piercing yellow eyes, and Governor Zaris. He approached slowly, studying Linux with open suspicion.
"So," Zaris growled, "the vaunted conqueror comes to our doorstep. Tell me, Linux, have you come to subjugate us as you did so many others?" Linux met Zaris's gaze steadily. "No, Governor. I come with an offer of partnership. The Sakari Empire, as you knew it, is gone. We stand on the brink of a new era." Zaris snorted derisively. "Pretty words, but actions speak louder. You arrive in our system with a dreadnought and immediately neutralize our defenses. Forgive me if I'm skeptical of your peaceful intentions." The two Sakari leaders stared each other down, the air crackling with tension. Finally, Zaris gestured towards a massive set of blast doors leading into the complex. "Follow me. We'll continue this discussion inside." As they walked through cavernous corridors hewn from bedrock, Emily leaned in close to Xavier. "This place is incredible," she whispered. "The engineering required to build something like this." Xavier nodded, his eyes darting warily to the armed escorts surrounding them. "Let's hope we get a chance to study it further, and not from the wrong side of a cell door." They entered a vast chamber dominated by a circular table. Holograms flickered above its surface, displaying tactical readouts and colony status reports. Zaris took his place at the head of the table, his inner circle of advisors flanking him. "Now then, Linux," Zaris said, leaning forward. "Explain to me why I shouldn't have you all executed as traitors to the Sakari way of life." Linux drew himself up to his full height. "Because the Sakari way of life as you know it is over, Zaris. The homeworld lies in ruins, our fleets are decimated, and the humans," he gestured to Bennett, Xavier, and Emily, "they've shown us a better path." Zaris's eyes widened in shock. "You can't be serious. You would have us submit to these aliens." "Not submit," Linux said firmly. "Cooperate, learn, grow. I've seen firsthand the wonders their technology and knowledge can bring. They offer us a chance not just to survive, but to thrive." For hours the debate raged. Linux laid out the full scope of recent events, the devastating human counterattack, the coup attempt, the radical shift in Sakari policy. Zaris and his advisors listened with growing disbelief. As the discussion wore on, Emily stepped forward, addressing the colony leaders directly. "Gentlemen, I understand your hesitation, But consider this, the skills that made you fierce warriors can be turned to exploration, to scientific advancement, to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The galaxy is vast and there are challenges aplenty that don't require conquest. A murmur ran through the assembled Sakari. Zari sat back, his expression unreadable. You've given us much to consider, Linux, but I cannot make a decision of this magnitude alone. My council and I must deliberate. Linux nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. Of course, but know this, Zaris, one way or another, change is coming to Ricorius. I hope you'll choose to be part of shaping that change, rather than being swept aside by it. Zaris rose, his voice gruff but not unkind. You and your advisors will be confined to the guest quarters while we discuss. I give you my word as a warrior that no harm will come to you during this time. As they were led away, Linux caught Bennett's eye. The human admiral's expression was grim but determined. They both knew that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of Ricorius, but potentially that of the entire Sakari species. The austere guest wing of Ricorius Colony's mega-bunker felt more like a prison cell with each passing day. Linux paced the narrow confines, his claws clicking against the polished floor. The room's sparse furnishings, a simple bed, a desk, and a single chair, seemed to mock their status as honored guests. Any word from Zaris? Xavier asked, looking up from a datapad he'd been studying. Linux shook his head, mandibles twitching in frustration. Nothing. My latest encrypted message went unanswered. As the days crawled by, Linux redoubled his efforts to reach Zaris. He crafted carefully worded messages, each one a delicate balance of warning and enticement. The vast human fleet hanging in orbit was an unspoken threat, but Linux focused on the potential for growth, for a Sakari society freed from the shackles of endless conquest. Governor Zaris, he dictated, hunched over the room's secure terminal. Imagine Ricorius with advanced terraforming technology. Your deserts could bloom. Your people could thrive, not just survive. But Zaris remained unmoved. His terse replies, when they came at all, dripped with skepticism. Pretty words from a defeated commander, one message sneered. The Sakari will not be seduced by false promises. After 6 days of fruitless negotiation, Bennett had had enough. The Admiral's weathered face was set in hard lines as he demanded an audience with Zaris. This diplomatic dance has gone on long enough, he declared. It's time for some straight talk, soldier to soldier. When the guards finally escorted Bennett to Zaris's war room, the tension was palpable. The Sakari governor glowered from behind a massive desk, his scaled hands clenched into fists. Bennett wasted no time with pleasantries. He activated a holographic projector, filling the air between them with a dazzling array of ships. Hundreds, then thousands of vessels materialized, surrounding a to-scale representation of Ricorius. This is the combined might of Earth's fleets, Bennett stated flatly. We could reduce this entire colony to slag within hours if we chose. Zaris's eyes widened, but his voice remained defiant. Then why haven't you? Why this charade of diplomacy? Bennett deactivated the hologram, leaning forward. Because subjugation isn't our goal. We want partners, not slaves. And that offer extends to every Sakari world smart enough to take it. He let the implications sink in. Think about it, Zaris. Do you want Ricorius to be at the forefront of a new age, or left behind as a footnote in history? The Sakari governor's facade cracked, uncertainty creeping into his eyes. I will need to consult with my council. The next day, Linux and his team found themselves before the full governing body of Ricorius. The cavernous chamber buzzed with tension as Linux laid out the terms of cooperation. He spoke of joint scientific ventures, of revitalized infrastructure, of a Sakari people who could channel their strength into exploration rather than conquest. General Mokrev, Zaris's right-hand man, spat on the floor. Cowards talk! We should fight to the last rather than submit to these aliens. The debate raged for hours. Voices were raised, insults hurled. But as the arguments circled back on themselves, a subtle shift began to occur. The promise of prosperity, of relevance in a changing galaxy, began to outweigh pride and tradition. When the final vote was called, the chamber fell silent. Zaris himself cast the deciding ballot, his voice barely above a whisper. For the future of Ricorius, we accept the terms. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Human ships descended from orbit, bringing not weapons but engineers, scientists and agricultural experts. Linux watched with a mixture of pride and trepidation as the first joint Sakari human projects took shape. But not everyone embraced change so readily. Reports of sabotage trickled in, a human shuttle's engines mysteriously failed, a newly installed water purification system was found damaged. Mokrev's influence, though diminished, still poisoned some minds against cooperation. Linux responded swiftly, working with Zaris to identify and isolate the most vocal dissenters. It was a delicate balance, firm enough to maintain order, but not so harsh as to create martyrs for the old ways. As he oversaw the integration of human technology into Ricorian infrastructure, Linux knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time in generations, there was hope for a Sakari future built on something other than conquest and subjugation. The true test would come in the years ahead, as this experiment in cooperation spread to other Sakari worlds. Linux steeled himself for the task, knowing that every success on Ricorius would make the next world that much easier to bring into the fold. The air in Ricorius's war room crackled with tension. Admiral Bennett's eyes darted between the holographic displays and the faces of those gathered around him. Hestrick, the newly appointed governor, stood rigid, his scaled skin glistening under the harsh light. "We can handle this internally," Hestrick insisted, his voice low and gravelly. "Give us time to root out these dissidents without human interference." Xavier shook his head, his diplomat's veneer cracking. "And how many more attacks will we endure while you fumble in the dark? Every day we delay emboldens Mokrev's fanatics." Bennett's comm unit buzzed. He glanced down, seeing Emily Carson's coded transmission. His gut tightened as he decrypted her message, each word hammering home the gravity of the situation. "Gentlemen," Bennett cut in, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind, "I've just received intelligence that changes everything." He tapped a few commands, bringing up a map of Ricorius. Red dots blossomed across its surface, far more numerous than the handful of incidents Hestrick had reported. "This is the true extent of Mokrev's influence," Bennett explained, watching Hestrick's eyes widen. "And it gets worse. They're amassing weapons, off-world tech we haven't even seen before." A low murmur rippled through the room. Hestrick's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation Bennett had learned to recognize. "Impossible," the governor sputtered. "Our patrols would have—" "Would have what?" Xavier interrupted, leaning forward. "Noticed something you didn't want to see, or perhaps couldn't see, blinded by your own pride?" Bennett raised a hand, silencing the brewing argument. "The why doesn't matter now. What matters is our response." He paced the length of the war table, mind racing. Trust Hestrick and risk catastrophe, or take direct action and potentially shatter the fragile peace they'd worked so hard to build? "We need to move fast," Bennett decided, turning to face the room. "But we do this together. Hestrick, I want a full accounting of your forces, their deployments, everything. Xavier, reach out to our network of Sakari moderates. We'll need their support to isolate Mokrev's hardliners." Hestrick bristled. "You overstep, Admiral. This is still a Sakari world." "A Sakari world on the brink of chaos," Bennett countered, meeting the governor's gaze. "I'm not here to conquer, Hestrick. I'm here to prevent a bloodbath. Work with us, or watch everything we've built crumble." For a long moment silence reigned. Then slowly Hestrick nodded. "Very well, but my people lead the operation. We cannot appear weak before the insurgents." "Agreed," Bennett said, allowing himself a small measure of relief. "Now let's get to work. We have a rebellion to quash and a peace to save." As the war room erupted into activity, Bennett's thoughts turned to Emily Carson. risking everything out there in the field. He only hoped they could act in time to prevent Mokrev from unleashing his stockpile of destruction upon an already fractured world. The war room of the Rykorian Command Center hummed with activity as Admiral Bennett's fingers flew across the holographic interface, absorbing Emily Carson's latest intelligence report. His face hardened as the true scope of Mokrev's insurgency became clear. "Linux," Bennett called, his voice cutting through the din. The Sakari general strode over, mandibles clicking with tension. "We need to move now." Bennett brought up a three-dimensional map of Rykorius, red dots blossoming across its surface like a virulent infection. "This is the real situation. Mokrev's influence runs deeper than we imagined." Linux's eyes narrowed as he studied the display. "By the void," he hissed. "How did we miss this?" "It doesn't matter now," Bennett replied, his tone grim. "What matters is our response. We can't afford to pull our punches any longer." The Sakari general nodded, his posture straightening. "Agreed. We crush this insurrection before it can take root." Within moments, the orbital space above Rykorius blazed with activity. Massive troop carriers, their hulls gleaming in the harsh sunlight, took up positions alongside sleek human warships. Linux watched from the bridge of his command vessel as waves of dropships detached, plummeting towards the planet's surface. On the ground, Mokrev stood atop a hastily constructed barricade, his scales jam-packed with fury as he watched the sky darken with incoming ships. "Stand fast," he roared to his assembled militia. "We will not bow to these alien—" His words were drowned out by the thunderous impact of drop pods slamming into the sand mere meters away. The pod's doors blew open, disgorging squads of heavily armed Sakari warriors. Human mechs stomped across the dunes, their massive footfalls shaking the earth. Mokrev's troops, a ragtag collection of disillusioned colonists and hardline veterans, raised their weapons with shaking hands. The air filled with the sizzle of energy weapons and the staccato bark of human firearms. Linux led the charge, his battle armor gleaming as he vaulted over a makeshift barricade. He locked eyes with Mokrev across the chaotic battlefield. The rebel leader snarled, drawing a wicked-looking blade. Their duel was swift and brutal. Linux's superior training showed as he parried Mokrev's wild slashes, his own strikes precise and measured. With a final, decisive blow, Linux disarmed his opponent, sending him sprawling to the sand. As the dust settled, Linux stood over the defeated Mokrev, his voice carrying across the now silent battlefield. "It's over. Your insurrection ends here." Hours later, with the last pockets of resistance mopped up, Linux addressed the combined human Sakari force. Bennett and a chastened Governor Hestrak flanked him on either side. "Today we faced a grave threat to everything we've built," Linux began, his voice firm. "Let this serve as a warning. We will not tolerate those who would drag us back into the darkness of our past." In a private briefing afterward, Linux turned to Bennett, his expression troubled. "This victory may be short-lived. Mokrev's network likely extends beyond Rykorius." Bennett nodded grimly. "You have Earth's full support, General. Whatever it takes to root out these extremists, you'll have the resources you need." As they plotted their next moves, both leaders knew the true test lay ahead. The battle for Rykorius was won, but the war for the Sakari's future had only just begun. The acrid stench of burning synthetics and scorched earth filled Linux's nostrils as he surveyed the devastation on Vulcar 7. The planet's blood-red sky, choked with debris from the orbital bombardment, cast an eerie glow over the battlefield. Craters pockmarked the landscape, testament to the ferocity of the assault. Linux's armor, once gleaming, was now scarred and dented. He stepped over the twisted remains of a Sakari battle tank, its hull still smoldering. Around him, human and Sakari soldiers moved with grim purpose, securing the perimeter and tending to the wounded. "General," a voice crackled through his comm, "we've breached the inner sanctum." Linux's mandibles clicked in acknowledgement. He strode towards the fortress, its imposing facade now crumbling. As he entered, The stench of chemicals assaulted his senses. Row upon row of containment units lined the walls, filled with a sickly, luminescent fluid. "By the void," Lennox muttered, his scales overflowing at the sight. A human scientist in a hazmat suit approached, her voice muffled. "Sir, preliminary scans confirm our worst fears. This isn't just one virus, it's dozens of engineered strains." Lennox's fists clenched. The true scope of the threat they'd narrowly averted hit him like a gravitational shockwave. In an adjacent chamber, Admiral Bennett stood over a captured Sakari loyalist. The prisoner's scales were dull with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with fanatical hatred. "You've accomplished nothing," the loyalist spat. "Our cause will endure. The Sakari will rise up." Lennox nodded, but the victory felt hollow. He gazed at the sea of containment units, each one representing countless lives that could have been lost. The cost had been staggering. Tracek 4's underground labs sealed forever, Ralkin's mining facilities reduced to slag, and now this. As they exited the fortress, Lennox watched a group of human and Sakari soldiers working side by side to clear debris. The cooperation was there, but he sensed an undercurrent of tension. Trust, once fractured, would not easily be repaired. Bennett seemed to read his thoughts. "This isn't the end, you know. It's just the beginning of a new chapter." Lennox's gaze swept over the scarred battlefield. "A chapter written in blood and mistrust," he replied, his voice heavy. The Admiral's face hardened. "Maybe, but it's better than the alternative." As they boarded the shuttle that would take them back to orbit, Lennox couldn't shake the feeling that they'd won the battle, but lost something far more precious. The promise of true partnership between their species seemed to recede with each passing moment, replaced by a wary vigilance that would define their relationship for years to come. The shuttle's engines roared to life, lifting them away from the blasted surface of Vulcar 7. Lennox watched through the viewport as the planet shrank beneath them, a stark reminder of the cost of peace and the eternal price of guarding against its loss. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.